Isn't it weird that we actually stand in groups of people, all with our binoculars, looking at various spots on the horizon or in the bush or something, but we never actually look at ourselves. And that's really fascinating. It's a subject that we don't actually think much about. So that's why today I'm very happy to start the 4th season of In Conservation with a brilliant guest, Dale Forbes. Dale and I have known each other for a long time, but before we actually say hello to Dale, let me just quickly get the house things out of the way, and that is to quickly mention our sponsors. Thank you very much for Leica Sport Optics, who have been sponsoring the whole of this for 3 seasons now, and our new sponsor, CJ Wildlife, and they are a team of passionate nature lovers and experts in garden wildlife, on a mission to make nature accessible for everyone. Whether you're a nature novice or a garden guru, they want to inspire, educate, and provide the right tools to help wildlife thrive right on your doorstep. So that's them, and that's what they do. And thank you very much for actually allowing us, or should I say, for sponsoring us. But Dale, very pleased to have you here, or at least there. How are you and where are you?
Hi, David. I'm doing well, and I am in Western Austria in the Alps. So if it were daylight, I could see mountains right here.
That's amazing. I'm in a very hot hotel room, actually. I'm in Lloret de Mar in Spain, just 100 miles or kilometers even south of Barcelona. I'm here for a photographic festival. I'm actually speaking, and so that's why I'm here. A little bit that matters because you don't know where I am anyway.
Well, I mean, actually, the birds who pass through the Inn Valley where I live, if they're heading in the classic northeast southwest route, they're going to pass through the Alps and come out of the Alps at like Lago Maggiore and head down towards the coast. So like my birds are going to be by you in a few days. So keep a lookout for them. They're my birds, by the way.
Well, that's good news. I will be keeping a watch out, especially given that my talk is tomorrow and then I've got nothing else to do till Monday. So I think I'll be actually definitely having a look out. Now, we've known each other for a while. I can't even remember the first time I met you, to be honest, but I can't remember at all. But Dale works for Swarovski, and many of you may know who and what Swarovski is. But I mean, Dale, tell us what you do in your day job.
Oh, yeah. So my role in the company is quite diverse, but some of the things that my department is responsible for is target group management. So we've got people responsible for our various target groups and then our market research. But what I'm kind of focusing on at the moment is thinking about midterm strategy for the company. How's the company going to be developing?
Okay, and what's that in English?
I study people and think about how to serve those people better.
That's good. That sounds interesting. Yeah, and I've known you for a long time. And for those who don't know, Dale, I mean, you're obviously based in Austria, but I've seen you around the world in various different places. I mean, most notably, I mean, apart from Bird Fair, I remember seeing you once or twice, actually, or many times actually, in Israel when we used to do.
Yeah, exactly. Israel, and Portugal.
Yeah,
and probably Spain at some stage.
But what I like about Dale is the fact that he, represents Swarovski. I am sponsored by Leica, and I remember being in a hide with him, and there was a member of the public in the hide as well, and she obviously saw that I was wielding Leicas and you were wielding Swarovskis, and she said, "So which one's the best one to get?" And I kept quiet, and what was great was that Dale turned around and said, "Well, they're both great." But, and then he went into the actual sort of both kind of qualities for both binoculars. And I thought that was a really, nice thing to do in many respects, because it shows that it's not all about, massive competition and beating each other up. It's actually, we're all in it together, and we should all kind of, work together in many ways.
Absolutely. And that's certainly how I and we see the world. It's not about competition. Like, we're both there for for people who are passionate about wildlife and nature. And that's cool. That's fantastic.
Yeah. So you obviously have an interest in people. And I came to realize that when I saw you give a presentation online for the Columbia Bird Fair last year, was it this year? I can't remember.
Earlier this year, yeah, beginning of this year.
And it was fascinating because as I said earlier on, right at the very top of this sort of broadcast, you don't really think about people and how, what birders consist of. I mean, there's often lots of conversations that people have, especially in the NGO world, when they talk about, or imagine there's a split in terms of X amount of women and X amount, Y amount of men and all this sort of stuff. But you've had a really close look at this. So it'd be really interesting. We might just go straight into this. It'd be really interesting to sort of hear your views on birder watching.
Yeah, so I've always been interested in people. I find them fascinating creatures. My background, my original years as a teenager, and then going through my student years, I was studying birds and other vertebrates. And it was actually when I moved to Austria that I'd been studying birds and animals for quite a while, that I ended up doing a couple of marketing courses at the local university here in Austria. And I realized actually, like, studying people, this is kind of like studying birds, but I can talk to them. I mean, I can talk to birds, but like other people look at me weird when I talk to birds, but like I can actually talk and interact with people, and which then just kind of grew my interest in studying people even more. And because I'm a passionate birder myself, it was just like so obvious to start looking at birders. And so I started doing what I now call birder watching, where I'm just trying to understand the world around me. And I suppose I've been a birder all my life. I grew up a birder, but even from my earliest childhood days, I was just really into wildlife. I was always like running around in streams or looking for snakes, or interested in plants, collecting seeds, growing stuff. And at some stage, my dad got a beginner common bird book, Common Birds of Southern Africa. And he got, for his birthday, he got a pair of binoculars. And then we started to go on these trips, these like wildlife trips to wonderful game parks and things in South Africa. My parents really supported the whole family in discovering wildlife. And at some stage, birds became a very important part to that. But I've always been interested in everything, but birds became a big thing. And so I had this family environment in which I grew up with birds. And I think that might be familiar to some of you, that you also grew up with an aunt or a grandfather or somebody who introduced you to this love of birds. But there are also other people who discover it because maybe they were interested in dinosaurs and then realized that that dinosaurs still exist, like birds are dinosaurs. And they had that as this kind of gateway drug into the bird world. But there are also other people that as an adult, they maybe have a spark bird where they're looking outside one day and they see a goldfinch on their feeder and they're just like, wow. And they come find it as an adult. And there are other people who maybe discover it while studying biology at university. It's also a story we hear quite often. They kind of get drawn into this world of birds. And it's this diversity of how we get into it, but also of birders that really intrigues me. I find that so fascinating about birds and bird people.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I mean, you obviously were, born and raised in South Africa. Was there a bird that you actually recall seeing and identifying first?
No, I didn't have I don't think I had a conscious spark bird.
Right.
I do remember some like early childhood memories where I remember like drawing sketches of laughing doves on nests in my garden. And I remember like the fiscal shrikes in the garden. And then on one of the first trips we went to a game park, we saw this big bluebird, and in our book, all we had is the lilac-breasted roller, bluebird with a lovely pink chest. But my bird was like that, but all blue. And it took me going into a shop to, the shop at the park to look in the big bird book to find a European roller. And so I definitely had these like birds that stood out to me when I was a young child, but I didn't have a spark bird because I don't think there was a time that I wasn't aware of birds.
Okay. So whilst you get your presentation ready, just to tell everyone, all you Zoomers, that you can watch this on not the gallery view, but speaker view, to get the best out of this. And once again, thank you very much for joining us in Conservation With. I'm really so happy. This is amazing to be back here and talking to people and finding out, learning about new stuff.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Totally.
It's actually a lot of the photos in here are like company photos, and most of the people actually work for us. So this is Christina. She works in our service departments, also loves wildlife, and this is on the Norfolk coast. I love that picture of her. But we've been talking about like birders, and I suppose we kind of need to have some sort of a definition of what is a birder. And I'm going to assume that everybody here is a birder, but or at least into birding. But I'm going to start off a little bit more general. And the thing is that as a child, it was obvious for me that like what a birder was. A birder was somebody who watched birds. But as we get older, it seems adults really like to make things complicated. We like to pigeonhole stuff, and we like to have little definitions, and like, oh, these people are like me, those people aren't. And so we overcomplicate things. And so I'm going to go ahead and overcomplicate this as an adult, and talk about different definitions within this bird world. And the first one, I'm going to call it the birder. And the birder, we've got these various different words in English, a birder. And we also use the term bird watcher, but within this world, I think about birders being somewhat more active. They're proactively getting out there, more target oriented. They want to find specific species, and so going out and trying to find a Tecla's lark. And it's kind of like I compare my own mind to being like the Pokemon Go of the real world. You're getting out there and you're wanting to find birds, very active, proactive. Whereas the bird watcher, lots of overlap, slightly less goal-oriented, more willing to soak up the wilds, let nature unfold around you. So I've got a little bit of just allow birds to unfold themselves, enjoying wildlife and birds. And there's a third category that I talk about in classification is the scientist. And the scientist, as opposed to birders and bird watchers, they're ornithologists. They're thinking about studying birds, their behavior, biogeography, conservation of the species, genetics. And there are lots of ornithologists who are birders or bird watchers, but there are also lots of ornithologists who aren't necessarily birders. They're not necessarily interested in seeing lots of species. And one of my formative mentors as a teenager, he was a statistician, avian statistician, but he wasn't particularly interested in bird watching or birding. This was his job, and he was exceptionally good at it. He really influenced my life and how I see birds. But a few years ago, we were wondering, well, just how many birders are there in the world? Like, are there lots? Am I an oddity, or are there few? And we had no idea. And we looked at various studies, and there were some studies done in the UK, and like the RSPB has over 1 million members. Are they all birders? Do they count? Do they not? And there are some studies from the US, but we couldn't really get at data. And so we took the decision to try and quantify this. And so we we set up a huge big study to try and quantify how many birders there were out there. And we've started in 18 countries, but it was a good start. But the first thing you need to do is you need to create a definition, like from this point in time, somebody is a birder. Like this is the only pigeonhole we're going to count. And for various reasons, we came up with a almost ridiculously narrow definition of what a birder was. And so we said, well, for this study that we're doing, we're going to say that a birder is somebody who owns a pair of binoculars or a spotting scope and uses this for bird watching. I think it's a fairly logical kind of definitional basis. But then we thought, well, we actually want people who are doing this more actively, not just somebody who's doing it every now and again, but somebody who's actually going to go watch birds at least several times per month. This has narrowed it down a little bit, quite a lot actually. Then we thought, well, can we narrow this down even further? And so the third level that we added to this was, well, somebody who tried to identify every bird that they see. And that was about as strict as we could get in a definition without making people take tests. And we sampled, we did a panel study, which is essentially how they do election polling. And we did this through 18 countries where we asked 40,000 people tons of questions. So all statistically relevant sampling of people through these 18 countries. And we actually came out with a phenomenally large number of birders. And we're talking just in these 18 countries of about 18 million people, 25 million people that fit into that definition of a birder. Those are confidence intervals that just saying there. That's why you're seeing that dash. So we're seeing very large numbers of birders. But this also means that, for example, in Europe, there are almost 4 times as many birders as golf players. Everybody knows about golf, but birding as a hobby is not necessarily as well known. In the last couple of years, that started to change, actually. We're starting to see more mainstream awareness of birding. And that's one of those positive benefits of COVID that I'll come back to later. So we're seeing like 10 million birders in the US and at least as many in Europe. And this really surprised me. I was not expecting this many birders. And what we started to realize was that there is a smaller core of very connected birders who all know each other, and we're all in similar groups on Facebook, and we're going to similar places and stuff. But there is a huge collection of people out there who are not necessarily within a clearly defined community of birding, but they're just going out there and they're doing this. I suppose it's kind of like running. I'm also a passionate runner. You can look at like the running clubs, and you can look at marathon participants, and you'll have a small subset of people who are all in a very neat community. But the vast majority of runners are just doing it with their friends, and they're just doing it. They're just getting out there and doing it. And birding is kind of the same. The second surprising bit of information was about gender. And in Europe, we're looking at 50-50 men and women. In the US, we're looking at significantly more women than men. And this reflects data from other sources as well, but it was nice to see it reflected in our data. There are a lot, an interesting set of people out there. And the age of birders was also something that the more we dug into the data, this data set and also others, we found some interesting things, including that birders are very broadly distributed in their age. We're seeing a little bit of an uptick slightly later. We call them empty nesters, kids off at uni or grown up, have a little bit more time. on reserves. Like in the UK, we'll see a lot of older people on reserves. They just simply have more time. But that doesn't necessarily reflect the overall numbers of people that are out there and actually bird watching. Remember, this is all people that fall into that super tight definition of birding, or birders, I should say. Now, there is I mean, it would be a valid question to ask, well, what about somebody who just enjoys the birds in their garden? And do they not count as a birder? Of course they count as a birder. At some stage, we needed to make an artificial pigeonholing. But for me, I think that there is a broad swath of people who are interested in birds. And I love finding people who are enjoying their birds at home or in wild places. It doesn't matter how people enjoy it. But I think having this overly narrow definition and still coming up with large numbers like that was kind of a reinforcing element for me. Yeah, there are. This is a big movement out there. We can be. We can do stuff with this. We can move mountains. Now, one of the things I suppose we've all noticed is how important photography has become to birders. And just behind David there, he's got a camera. And I think that this is something we've all noticed, but photography is something that's important to about 69% of birders. There are a lot of people out there taking photos. And we've seen this huge rise in particularly the last decade or two, of people wanting to take photos. And most of the people are taking photos for their own pleasure. But whereas in the last few years, we've seen even more growth in people wanting to share in social media, or even starting to take more professionally directed photos. But this also kind of makes our definitions from further up a little bit more difficult. So at what stage do we distinguish between somebody who is a birder who really likes to take photos, and somebody who is a photographer who really likes birds? And maybe in the past there was a clearer distinction between these two, and now it's all just gray. And there was a paper that Tropical Birding published a couple of years ago, which I found really, really interesting. They did an online survey of mostly their customers, but they were asking a bunch of questions about birding and their wildlife interest in photography and stuff. And it's kind of summarized in this triangular graphic, where at the top we've got people represented by dots who are really into birding, people bottom left who are really into photography, people bottom right were really into wildlife. And an additional layer that they brought onto this is that they asked people about their self-reported change in the last decade. And so those blue dots were 10 years ago and the red dots now. And what we see there is that we've got people who 10 years ago considered themselves just birders, have now shifted way more towards photography, that birding and photography is more important. But equally so, people who thought about themselves as photographers 10 years ago are now thinking about themselves as both birders and photographers. Once again, they're graying. And maybe I could just read an interesting quote from their paper. It was, "On tour, we have noticed that birders now frequently pay more attention to other wildlife than they did in the past. Perhaps this is best illustrated in a country like Madagascar. Our tours here a decade ago focused on the endemic birds. Now, although we still see as many birds, people are more interested in seeing the geckos and taking photographs of the chameleons and the lemurs, and their interest has just broadened." And that broadening in interest is actually was reflected in our data as well, in that 90% of birders were also interested in other wildlife. And when we actually speak to people about this, we often find that their knowledge level differs between various taxa. So they might be extremely knowledgeable on, I don't know, gulls, but they're also interested in butterflies. They might not be very knowledgeable on butterflies, but they just find them fascinating. And I think that one of the things that's helped people get into new groups are the plethora of new apps that are out there, like iNaturalist or Seek. Do you guys know Seek, the app Seek? Oh, got to get Seek. Seek is wonderful. Like if I'm out anywhere in the world, I'm following my nose around with Seek, because there is so much to discover out there. There are butterflies and there are mushrooms, and just 2 days ago, I was walking through a forest in Switzerland and saw a mushroom at a distance, and I was like, oh, what's that? So I ran off to it, and as I got closer, I was like, oh, wow. Like, I don't know anything about mushrooms, but when I was at university, I'd learned about the death cap, and I was like, oh, I'm pretty sure this is a death cap. Pull out Seek, like, so then I could actually get up close and and then took some better photos, got it into iNaturalist. Yeah, it's a death cap, which has got, and I mean, a few years ago, I wouldn't have been able to do that. And we now have these ways that you can get excited about things, because I don't have a fungus book with me. And even if I did, they're hard to identify. And I don't have a dragonfly book with me or butterfly book with me. And like, I was just in Colombia, in southern Colombia. I don't know all the butterflies there. They've got thousands of them. But Seek does a pretty good job. And if Seek doesn't do it, then I'll take photos and put it into iNat. And so I think this is an exciting world. We're living in an exciting time that getting into wildlife is even easier. And the same is true for birds, that there are app possibilities now that are just helping us or helping other people get into birds, which I think is absolutely wonderful. And at the end of last year, I went on a wonderful trip with some friends, and we went, how long were we there? Probably there like a week or 10 days in Costa Rica. We went raging around Costa Rica and had a lot of fun. We were just like a bunch of birders being very intense. And near the end of the trip, I asked the group, like, what was your favorite experience? And some of the people chose like kind of listening and the patience and the time needed to find the unspotted saw-whet owl, which was a wonderful, magical experience in the Misty Mountains, actually very close to where we took this photo. And others said like the rarest sought-after birds, like agami herons, like that was amazing for them, or Cabanis's ground sparrow. And yet others like myself, for me, just being in the lowland tropical forests of La Selva or Golfo Dulce, like that's where my heart comes alive. This like experience of the liveliness of lowland tropical forests. But yet Diego, so the guy is twice in that picture. Diego, he's not that much into lowland stuff. You can do it, but like Diego's happiest in highland forests. And I found it absolutely fascinating how all of us we're rather intense birders, and we all got along exceptionally well, but we all get something slightly different out of our birding. It seems that we express our personalities through our birding. I thought that was really interesting. And looking back into our data, at the motivations, like what are people getting out of birding? Why do they do this? There's a broad range of things that people are interested in, but the thing that comes up time and again is quiet time in nature. And so the size of these keywords in the word cloud come from the presence, like how dominant they were. So quiet time in nature was the most important, but taking photos also really important to people. seeing new birds, no surprises there. People like to see birders like to see new birds. But also learning about nature in general, this learning about ecosystems and how things fit together. Seems like birders are curious and like to learn. Not necessarily about gull identification, but although there are enough people that like that. But another thing that came up time and again was this idea of time with friends, or people who are like me or like you. We like to spend time with people who we get along well with, or have a similar interests. And I really like that diversity of people. And one of the things that came up here was how lots of people found that birding was a kind of a medium for them to discover the world in different places. It took them to different places they never would have thought of before. And it was a fascinating way to see the world. And so we had 57% of birders enjoyed traveling to see birds. And that might be to a national park, or it might be to a neighboring country, or it might be to a far-flung location. And I must admit that I personally love traveling internationally. And particularly during the COVID years where that was more difficult, it became more and more apparent to me how important this was to me internally. I've tried to now logically understand it, but it seems something that's like deep in me. And I love being in places which I don't know and discover people who are very different from me and who have very different cultural backgrounds and foods, and meeting all these interesting different experiences, being exposed to new species. I love going into a forest and just having no idea what's going on. And there's this huge learning curve, and I love that enjoyment of being in a new place. But yet there is a cost of traveling internationally, not just in pounds, but that there is this the CO2 thing. And we live in a world where climate change is very real and has great consequences on our planet. And so we really need to find a way to take responsibility for our actions. And that includes our travel, but also our birding in general. What we now know is that our planet is in a dire situation. We need to save 30% of the planet by 2030 in order to safeguard wildlife and our existence. And this is part of some wonderful reports that have come up in the last couple of years, where we're really starting to understand the scale of the biodiversity crisis, but we're also understanding what needs to be done. And so as birders, we really need to be thinking about our contribution to the natural world. And we need to be committed to having a positive impact on the planet. And the thing is that there are lots of really great conservation organizations out there who are really working hard to steer us away from this biodiversity crisis that we seem to be steaming ahead straight towards. But something I personally find odd with many birders is that the willingness to contribute to conservation is fairly low. There seems that there is a lot of talk about it, but we need to actually be investing in conservation. Like, I don't have and none of us here have the financial resources of Jeff Bezos, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing something. And so contributing to one of those fine organizations or many others can really help to make a difference. And even if that's just a small amount. So, and that's because our species are disappearing. And a few years ago, a suite of conservation organizations led by the WWF started to look at the decline of vertebrates. And what they found was that in monitored populations of birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and fish, so the major vertebrates, on average, they decreased by 68% since the 1970s. I'm going to say this the other way around, which means that, so overall, since the 1970s, like in the 1970s, there were 3 times as many vertebrates as there are now. My children are growing up without vertebrates. And that's a scary situation. I was looking at another report recently, actually, where of all of the mammals on the planet, I'm going to try and get these numbers right, only 4% of the mammals on the planet in biomass are wild animals. The rest are either people or domestic animals. And so something needs to be done, and that's something that needs to be done is the 30% of the planet needs to be conserved. Now I'm going to circle all the way back to where I started about that carbon. So I kind of like mentioned carbon and then drifted off to biodiversity. And that's for a reason, because if we just play out a thought experiment and we all stop international travel, there are no more airplanes, then we can make a significant reduction in the CO2 output that's happening on the planet, which is wonderful for climate change. But what that does mean is that ecotourism then stops. And if ecotourism stops, then lots of livelihoods get put into a very difficult situation. That's exactly what we found in the COVID crisis, that suddenly people weren't able to rely on their ecotourism livelihoods and were needing to find other ways to sustain their livelihoods, to sustain their families. And so we saw poaching absolutely skyrocket in many places, and illegally or legally cutting down of forests just increased. Ecotourism has a role to play, because without ecotourism, the days of the mountain gorilla, the tiger, the amazing Masai Mara, they can only be limited. Ideally, we would have a global system where rich countries would pay for the biodiverse tropical countries to conserve their natural habitats and their species, but we do not have that system right now. And the closest we've got to that is ecotourism. And so we need to find a way for sensible ecotourism to be part of the solution, because otherwise our biodiversity is going to face even harder times. That's not to say that we get out of jail free with carbon. We need to find ways to take responsibility for that carbon, but I don't think that the solution is to stop ecotourism, because that has all sorts of other negative consequences, unintended consequences. But so I said that during COVID times, we saw this like dramatic changes in how people were traveling. But yet at the same time, what we saw is that there was a dramatic uptick in people's interest in nature. And so we looked at Google search terms. So you can actually look at how many people are searching for the various terms. And we looked at this word birds in various different languages. And we saw a dramatic uptick in people searching for birds. Like at that time that COVID first hit in, what was that, March 2020, this big jump up, and that stayed. That's remained. It wasn't just like for a month up and then back down again. That has stayed. People have gotten really into birds and wildlife in general, actually. What we've seen is, all the indications are that people have just gotten more interested in it. So we've got more people into birds, and then the people who are slightly into birds are a little bit more into birds, and people who are quite into birds have gotten even further into it, which is wonderful for our hobby, hopefully also for conservation. If we got more people who are interested in birds and wildlife, there is a greater momentum of people thinking about the importance, the value of wildlife. So I love the diversity of the birding world. And each of us here, and we all get something slightly different out of birds and birding, where we all feel some sort of passion. It moves us inside. Now, I'm sharing with you a picture of one of my happy places in the Colombian Amazon. Lowland tropical forests, screaming pikas in the background. I can hear it in my ears. This is where I get so much power and beauty from the world of birds. And I think that as birders, we have a role to play within the planet. We're not just doing this because we want to see a screaming piha, but birders, we need to be part of the solution. We need to be thinking about this 30% of the planet that needs to be protected. We need to be thinking about us moving forward in the long term. Thank you.
Well, I have to say thank you to you. I mean, this has raised so many interesting points and questions and thoughts. I mean, you know, just picking up on some of the things you've said regarding, for example, the increase in people interested in birds. I mean, I think we've all kind of seen that. I mean, I've noticed, for example, on social media, the number of people out there talking about their birding exploits, but also people, there's like a reservoir of people beneath that level of people who are interested but are not birders. So they are really kind of commenting on things they've noticed, or even, I mean, I noticed on my feed, for example, how people, you know, oh, that bird looks amazing. Do you see that in England or Spain? You know, they're inquisitive. One thing I want to ask, actually, just talking about that general sort of early part of your presentation, was the number of women. I've noticed in America, for example, you know, when I go birding in America, there is a load of women there. I've been birding since I was a kid in the UK, and I've, you know, grown up amongst men. And yes, there has been an increase in women. I've noticed that as well. And in Spain, a lot of the birders are women, even though most of the people interested in birders tend to be biologists or studying it in some kind of way. And in other countries like Germany, to me, it's a very male-orientated thing still, very, you know, male-orientated. But do you have any idea why so many women are taken to it, considering the safety aspects in potentially, you know, potential problems there, and also the potential problems with men mansplaining at the very least to, you know, being damn right, you know, not good at all at the other end of the scale?
There are about 17 questions in there, so I'm just going to slowly work through them as good as I can. So I was quite intrigued by those data initially, and I started to go to reserves with my eyes open, and started to look at the people who were actually on reserves. And I actually initially I had, it was a morning that I had gone out birding in Norfolk somewhere, and I came back for lunch, and I thought, yeah, I only saw men out birding this morning. Like that can't be right, my data. And then I took myself, I sat back again. I'm like, you know, I'm gonna pay more attention to it this afternoon. I went out, and it was 50-50, the people on the reserve, who, like, men and women. But my impression from the morning was that, oh no, it was men. But I started to realize what the difference was in my perception of them. That the more, I don't know if I want to call it hardcore, but the like super into it birders, the guys who were out there counting godwits, like they were guys, and all like, and with the big scopes, and they were all guys. But the people birding on the reserve was 50-50 women and men. But the ones who had stood out to me as the people, like my orientation figures, the people I would go to find out, like, is there a curly sandpiper here today? Like those people were tended to be more men than women. So I think that there is something of a perception thing to it, but I'm not British, so it's hard for me to say too much about the British birding scene. But you'd mentioned mansplaining, and I think that is something that I suspect might be existing there, which is creating a barrier to entry for women who are then not wanting to engage with that, not wanting to engage with chest beating. And actually, the developments within the US over the last 50 years have been really interesting. Apparently, in the 70s, birding was in the US was like dominated by men, and it seemed that there was a groundswell of people who weren't interested in that like chest beating or competitive approach to birding, and this groundswell just grew and grew and grew until it overtook American birding. And so it feels like we're kind of getting that in Europe as well, that we're getting people who are just getting into birds, engaged in birds and really into birds, and they're forming their own little communities, and they're detached from the old school groups of birders, but they're forming their own thing. They're doing their own thing. Does any of that make sense to you?
Well, it does. But does that mean, I mean, from what you're saying, and I'm not saying you, but I'm just saying generally, does that mean that if you see a group of birders, are you more likely, because of the way you see the birders, you know, in terms of the hardcore ones are men, or generally men, are you more likely to ask a man what's around than a woman?
And I've asked myself that question a lot, and I don't. But what I have noticed a lot is that I'll be traveling somewhere and I'll be standing next to a woman guide. Like she knows what's going on here. I don't. I'm a visitor here. And people will, like random people, men and women, will come up to us and ask me. So I think that they're like, I don't know what's going on. She's the expert. But it seems that there are still like cultural things going on here that are independent of birding, but because birders happen to be people as well, like it seems that these cultural things are still playing out, unfortunately.
Yeah. The other thing that you talked about, which I thought was really fascinating, and something that I only actually kind of thought about literally 2 months ago, and it's taken me all my life to actually get to this point, was when you talk about birding, you initially think birding, oh, anywhere, you go birding, you know, in rivers, you go birding in the jungle, blah, blah, blah. But I noticed in myself, for example, that if you said to me, what's your favorite habitat to be birding in? I'll be saying to you straight away, I want to be in the wetlands. I want to be in an urban environment. I don't really like jungles that much. I find them a bit boring, if I'm honest. I mean, they're great, but chasing shadows and hearing things a mile away don't excite me. Or if a guide's got a tape and is luring out some kind of ant thrush you never heard of 5 minutes before, that doesn't excite me. Whereas if I walk around a corner, for example, I went to Costa Rica myself. I led a tour the other day, the other month in Costa Rica. And one of the guides I spoke to earlier was saying, you know, I really want to find a new bird for Costa Rica. And I'm thinking, well, what the hell are you doing in a jungle? Go to a wetland and find a duck. It's easy, you know. For me, I just get more excited about it. And actually, you made a good point there, because there is this, you know, if you ask the average bird, and I'm sure people here today, the Zoomers and anyone in the future watching this, you're going to think to yourself, actually, I do prefer birding in this environment and not in the others. And you mentioned Diego, who's a good friend of mine too, who likes, you know, being up in the uplands. He came to Spain to go birding and he found it boring in terms of the open expanses. Give me a jungle, he said to me, you know. So it's interesting how we're quite, you know, different in our preferences.
Isn't that brilliant? Isn't that wonderful? How birds are all different. We all find different things to find exciting.
Exactly.
You said ant thrush, and I'm like, ant thrush.
Well, I'm like, oh, ant thrush.
Brilliant.
The other thing is that you mentioned, you touched on was contributions to conservation, and that's a really interesting point because there's been in Britain, for example, many times when people have gone on Twitches and suddenly there's someone come up with a bucket saying, "Can you put some money towards conservation?" And I've heard people moaning afterwards saying, "Oh, I don't want to give any money," and I'm thinking that's interesting because you and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and you raised a really interesting point in that hunting. The thing that we in the UK hold up a sort of a crucifix to actually plays a massive part in conservation in some countries, like for example the United States. And you were telling me about in Austria and Germany how it's a very different thing. Can you quickly sort of explain why hunting actually can help conservation?
And well, this sounds like a very, very long discussion, but long and convoluted discussion. But I think that's because one major difference between hunting and birding is that it is a regulated activity, and because it's regulated, people are accustomed to paying for it. And so in you had mentioned like the US and the duck stamp. In order to be able to hunt ducks, you need to be able to pay for a duck stamp, and which means that you're having to pay something for conservation. Whereas birders, we don't have to pay anything for conservation. We can just get a pair of binoculars and go out. And I think that's I think we need to change how we think about birding and our duty to the environment. That we don't have to pay anything mostly, but we should be, and we should want to contribute, and we need to find ways to contribute. And I'd mentioned some great organizations during the presentation. I think that there are great organizations out there, but that's the difference between being forced to pay something and doing it out of your free will. And as birders, we need to change how we think about that.
Yeah. Okay. And talking about Twitches and paying for things, on the subject of twitching, basically, in the news recently, even though it's a reoccurring theme, it's just been going on for time time since the beginning of time. And that is the situation recently on the Isles of Scilly in Shetland, where a lanceolated warbler showed up, and there was a whole group of guys, by the way, who are corralling it basically and kicking it out of the grass and clapping to make it fly out so they can have a view of it. What's your thinking on that? Why do people, in terms of the psychology, why do people do that? The very people who, on the face of it, are conservationists, supposedly, who would berate someone else who's not a birder, for example, for killing something or what have you, when their behavior actually is tantamount to the subject of their quarry possibly dying as well.
Yeah, and I get some of that group think and the adrenaline of the moment. You've just traveled across the country to try and get there, and there is this excitement. There are 50 people there, and it's all like there is an adrenaline there. So I get that we've all been in situations like that, and groupthink can be useful, but it can also bring out some very animalistic things in us, and we don't necessarily reflect in that moment. I think that talking about it is very useful, and that we can then it can help us reflect when we are in those situations that, oh, hang on, like everybody's doing this, but that doesn't mean that I need to do it. Everybody's jumping into the fire, so I don't need to. Or you can say something. It is a challenging situation.
Yeah,
I definitely avoid those situations.
Yeah,
it's not a motivational driver for me.
Yeah.
And so I don't identify with it, but I do see it in other situations. And this is a very human instinct. But just because it's a human instinct doesn't mean it's a good thing.
Yeah.
There are things that we just need to be aware of. How can we act responsibly in situations like that?
Yeah, because I have nothing against Twitchers, and I think a lot of Twitchers are actually, are good people. But I mean, I used to go twitching myself when I was younger, but it culminated in the time when I remember being on the Isles of Scilly, and there was a hermit thrush being found, or someone found a hermit thrush, and there was 900. I'm not kidding. There was 900 people standing around a bush, and I'm thinking, what am I doing? This is a complete waste of time. Everyone's standing around chatting about what I had for dinner last night, or talking about some historic moment 50 years ago with their mates. And I'm thinking, this isn't birding for me. This doesn't interest me. I'm not that fussed.
Yeah.
I'd rather find things. So that's when I kind of switched off to that. I mean, having said that, obviously, if there's something nearby, I'll go and look at it. But if there's a crowd of people, I'll turn the other way. I'm not really that fussed on that. It's not that important to me.
I suppose it's part of that diversity of birders. It kind of gets a lot of media attention because suddenly there's a crowd, a whole flock of 900 people around one poor hermit thrush. So it does get a lot of media attention. We need to be aware of what those consequences are. So those people who are into Twitch need to be aware of what the consequences to those birds or to that environment are. And if they are doing like conservation collections that everybody's contributing 10 pounds, and then suddenly the local like conservation organization is a couple £1,000 richer and can do something useful, like they're taking some positive action for that. In the same way as I need to, and other people who like to travel internationally, we need to take responsibility for our international travel. I'm not going to call that pot black, like this kettle's black as well, but I need to do something about what I do. And that's part of that diversity of how we all bird. We need to take responsibility for how we do it, but also how do we have a positive impact on the planet? How do we become planet positive?
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about this a bit further on in the Q&A directly after this broadcast, because for those people who are not members of the Urban Birder World community, you're going to miss a really nice conversation after this when I say goodbye to Dale. But if you are, then carry on tuning in, because you'll see the rest of it. But basically, at this point, I just want to sort of thank you very much, Dale, for coming down and actually talking to us about this really fascinating subject. It's opened a whole load of boxes in terms of different questions. I just got two more questions for you. If you could be anywhere on this planet, where would you be right now? I got a feeling I know, but let's just hear your answer.
I might surprise you, but I've done a lot of traveling recently, which was absolutely wonderful. But right now, I've got my two kids sleeping over here. I want to be right here with them, and I want to be right here in my mountains. And I don't want to be more than 200 meters from my house. I want to go to my little, the river is over here with the little riparian woodland, and sometimes I get hawfinch. I want to be right here.
Oh, lovely. And have you got a favorite bird at all?
I do. It's the Malayan banded pitta.
Oh, beautiful.
So a tropical lowland bird that likes leeches. So if you're the best time to find them is when your legs are covered with leeches.
Oh,
it's gonna excite you, doesn't it, David?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, in the forest. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Yeah, well, listen, thank you for coming. I just want to quickly tell people a couple of things. Coming up, we have a whole load of different people. I'm not going to read through all of them because there's so many. But the next, say, 3 guests on the 10th of October, we've got Jeffrey. In fact, his name, even though it's written as Jeff Roy, it's actually something completely different. And I'll have to practice it before we actually do the live thing. Jeff Roy, Site Gessi, I think his name is. He's from Senegal, but he's going to be talking, and he actually works with the BirdLife Senegal. He's going to be talking about the Great Green Wall, which is a combination of different countries across that band of Africa that are working together to try and protect, particularly protect migratory birds. 3 days later, on the 13th of October, we've got a guy called Hans Pullman, who is involved in vulture conservation, the actual NGO, and he'll be talking about saving Europe's vultures. And on the 17th of October, we've taken a long time to get this young lady. Her name is Bella Lack. She is a conservationist and an activist. She's, I think, 17 or 18 now. She's a massive rising star. She's written a book, and she's going to be talking about tomorrow's conservationists. And then there's a load more people to come. So please keep tuning in to In Conservation with. There's a lot of stuff happening. And I just want to end on a note. I just want to say that I'd like to dedicate this episode of In Conservation with to a late friend of mine. His name is Nigel Mill. I met him birding actually on one of my tours in Mallorca, and we became very good friends. And he was a really lovely man and very generous. In fact, well, basically last year, unfortunately, he contracted bowel cancer, and he passed a month ago now, or maybe 3 weeks ago now. So I'd like to dedicate this program to him. He's actually in his will given a sum of money to set up a foundation, which I've been trying to sort of organize since I first started becoming the Urban Birder. It's going to be called the Urban Birder NDM, Nigel David Mill Foundation. And we've already got something in that we have 2 acres of a island in South Africa named after the foundation. And I've forgotten the name of the seabird island, but it's an island near Durban. And so I was gutted that he wasn't alive to see the certificate that came through, the saying that we actually own that piece of land. But anyway, this is for you, Nigel. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Zoomers. And hope to see you again real soon. And don't forget, keep looking up.